Welcome to Life by Design, episode 319. Welcome to Life by Design. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards, and I'm not joined today by my colleague, Dr. Horatio Jug. We are creators of Life by Design with 25 plus certified locations worldwide. Each week on the show, we discuss the principle and the practice of Life by Design. Today, we're answering one of the most often asked questions, whether it be on the podcast, whether it be in practice or otherwise, and that's, are supplements effective? And it's a really great question, and Horatio and I were going to talk about this today, but the schedules didn't work out. So I thought it was a great opportunity still to go into the conversation. It's so funny because not only was I having this in practice multiple times this week, but my wife Dana and I were having this conversation literally 2 hours ago. So I think it's very fitting that we're recording this today. And I'm going to walk you through some of my thoughts about supplements, whether they're effective, whether we require them. If so, which ones we require and who would require them. So I want to answer those questions for you today because I know this is one of the most, like I said, often asked questions. And we've got a lot of people in our practice and part of Life by Design who wonder this, and they're probably taking some supplements. So right off the bat, I guess the first question would be, do I have supplements? Do I recommend supplements? And I would say very few. And I'll give you my rationale as to why. And it doesn't mean that everybody requires only very few. There's, different situations where people would benefit, and I'll do my best to guide you through that line of thinking today so you can understand for yourself, and it's not just taking this as a blanket statement. So it's one of those, it depends, and it depends on the situation and the context. So that's what we'll dig into today. And what really prompted it was a study that was from the Annals of Internal Medicine looking at supplementation levels versus nutrient levels in a couple really, really big areas, all-cause mortality. So essentially, what are people dying of just in any way, shape, or form? And then in terms of cancer and cardiovascular disease. So some pretty big ones that I think are really important for people to think about and consider. And did it benefit people to be on some form of supplementation? Did it benefit them in terms of the food they were eating? Did it increase their lifespan? Would they have more incidents of these conditions? So that's what we want to get into today. It was a big study, and I think it's worth considering some of the information. There's limitations to this study, like there is all of them, similar to the one we spoke about a couple weeks ago. I'll put the study in the show notes, guys, and you can check it out, lifebydesign.com/podcast, and take a look and see what you think if you want to get into that. But I'll cover it for you today. I'll give you the general overview. It was a cohort study, and it looked at a lot of people. It was 31,000 adults in the United States, 20 or above. And, one of the limitations always is filling out food questionnaires and completing a survey. But nonetheless, that's how they collected the data. And so, a little difficult probably to hone in on the dosages and so on. But still, I think there's valuable information here, and there's definitely a correlation, a strong correlation, and something that we need to consider. It definitely matches up with what I think and what I had already thought. And I want to give you some of the rationale behind it here. So let me go over the findings first, and then I'll talk a bit about it. One of the findings when they looked at specifically vitamin K and magnesium was that it decreased mortality. And you thought, oh, that's great. Same thing when you looked at vitamin A, K, and zinc, decreased mortality from cardiovascular disease. Okay, wonderful. But when they were actually looking at the difference between the food intake of that nutrient versus the supplement intake of that nutrient, it was very, very different. And so if it was from supplements, with the case of vitamin K, magnesium, and decreased mortality, there was no improvement. So there was no correlation. But if it was from food, there was a correlation with decreased mortality. And then the same is true with AK and zinc. The decreased mortality from cardiovascular disease was only when these nutrients were obtained from food, not supplements. And then the flip side was excessive calcium intake, which we've talked before about this. And a lot of people are, they've been taking a calcium supplement for a long time. We talked about bone health, and people automatically think, oh, I need more calcium, when really I think there's other factors that are more important than that. But nonetheless, excess calcium intake was associated with an increased risk of death from cancer. And it was related to the consumption of 1,000 milligrams a day of a supplement, but not with increased calcium from food. So, it really is telling this story, this narrative about when we eat real food and we obtain our nutrients from real food. If you go deeper, I think what it's telling us is this story about the idea of sufficiency and deficiency. And we've talked about requirements and strategies. So I think when you say, okay, is this good for everybody, or is this something that's effective for some people? It would depend if there was a deficiency. Now, I'm not talking necessarily just a deficiency from what is necessary not to have clinical symptoms of a deficiency. So, there's a certain level of vitamin C you would need not to have scurvy, but it doesn't make the level of vitamin C necessary to be optimally well or have the cells of the body functioning well the same as the level to just avoid scurvy. Outside the scope of today's conversation, and that optimal level can be difficult to figure out. So understand that most of the RDAs or the recommended allowances are really built around what do you need not to have a specific identifiable disease process. And that just is generally how most healthcare, quote unquote, works, is it's what do we need to do not to be in the negative, not what do we need to do to be in the positive. And when you look at whatever that number is, so let's take a certain amount of, vitamin D is a great one because that's in the news a lot. It's being studied a lot. And let's say that there's a certain amount of vitamin D, whatever that is for optimal. If somebody had enough of vitamin D production, then adding more could be detrimental. And if someone was deficient in vitamin D, adding more is going to be a positive. And so the same is true for all the nutrients. And so to take a look at this and just say, okay, I'm going to blanket across the board, just add a bunch of supplements because, hey, topping them up, it's going to be better. I'm going to make sure I have enough. But if you already have enough of a certain nutrient, adding more could actually be negative. So we don't want to look at supplements as something that you just throw in to add in to top things up and make sure you've got extra of everything. I mean, even water, as a good example, is potentially toxic in excessive amounts. Just because we know water is great for us, and people are generally deficient in water or dehydrated, adding water brings them up to a competent hydration level, and their body performs and functions, and the cells perform and function better. Great. That's the whole concept of sufficiency and deficiency. What do we recommend? Typically, in most cases, we recommend very few. I think omega-3s, the research has established that there's a high level of omega-3 to 6 imbalance, and so hence a deficiency in omega-3 or essential fats. I think for the bulk of people, depending on where you live, obviously in the world and some other factors, you're probably deficient in vitamin D, so adding vitamin D. The current research that's available on gut health shows that we're probably deficient in a healthy gut biome, and so helping develop a healthy gut biome is valuable, so whether it be probiotics or prebiotics or other things along that ilk. And that's essentially it for the most part. I mean, we do have available a whey protein isolate. It's not a whole food supplement in that sense, but I think from a convenience factor, most people are deficient in protein, and whey isolate can be a beneficial protein for many people unless you have a dairy allergy or some type of response or negative response to dairy. So again, you've got to start asking yourself, am I sufficient or deficient in this? Now, the flip side is, people will say things like, and this was the conversation we were having today, people will say things like, okay, but our soil is depleted, or we're not getting the nutrients that we once did in our food. And while that is actually true, with the limited research that's available, by the way, so it's not as if this area has been extensively studied. With the limited research available, it is true that it seems though our nutrients are less than they were in Canada, United States, and United Kingdom, where this research has been done. It's less than it was, 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. But, here comes the but. It's not less to the degree that we're often told. And when you look at, whether it be claims on social media or claims by specific groups of people promoting specific diets, the claim often is that, we are deficient by 50, 100 times, or you'd have to eat, 10 times the amount or 40 times the amount of whatever it is, vegetables today than you would have had to years ago. And so that usually acts as a justification for selling a certain product. And again, I'm not against products that are going to be beneficial. I am definitely not against selling things that are valuable for people. So that's not the issue. It's, am I deficient in this? And if I am, then adding this in is going to be beneficial if I can't get it from a whole food source. So when it comes down to things like, if you look at these studies, you take vitamin C again as an example. People say, okay, you're going to have 50 times the spinach in order to get the vitamin D, and you just can't do that, so it's better to take a multivitamin. I'm not saying taking a multivitamin is necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think it's quite as extreme as it's made out to be. Specifically, if you look at vitamin C and you look at spinach, as the example we were using, you look at the vitamin C level, it's, I believe it is, this is an extreme one, vitamin C being the most, 45% lower. So that's a lot, of course, but that's not 50 times. It's, you'd have to eat twice as much spinach. So if you think about a serving of spinach being, a handful, a bunch of spinach, to think that I'd have to eat twice as much of that is not extreme to the, the line of, okay, I'm going to have 50 salads today just to get my vitamin C level. So that's not the case. And vitamin C is one of the more extreme ones, whereas most of the other nutrients are, 1 to 2 times the amount that you'd have to eat. So we're not talking about a massive, massive overhaul, but this is where, unless you're getting, 10 servings of fruit and vegetables, and again, remember, a serving, people think a serving is this massive, one salad is a serving, but in one salad, you could very well have 10 servings of vegetables. So unless you're not getting that, then I think, sure, supplementing with a green food supplement ideally, or a quality multivitamin, that would be great. No problem there, and I don't have an issue with that in terms of supplementation. But again, it's not to this extreme case where our soil's depleted, our nutrient base is depleted. You need hundreds of times, the food that you did years ago in order to get that. It really comes down to what we talked about before. And if we go back to this study and the things that this study are telling us, getting nutrients from real food is very different than getting nutrients from a supplement. And there's probably a lot of different reasons why. There's a lot of other factors that come along with real food, and just isolating a nutrient from real food is going to, and clearly in this case, at least in a correlation sense, affects the body differently than if I'm consuming the whole food. And if you're deficient, it'd be interesting to be able to actually do a study where we were looking for people who were deficient and having an actual metric as to whether they were deficient, and then adding in a supplement and seeing if we got the same effect simply because they were deficient in this, versus just everybody across the board getting studied and not breaking it up into those specific groups. So I think the question you need to ask yourself is, one, I should be starting with real food, and am I eating real food at every single meal? That's really the fundamental principle. If I'm eating real food, and that's my main focus, there's probably a really good chance, especially if the food is coming from quality sources, it's meeting the other, what we call eat by design strategies, and protein, good fats, lower on the sugar end, those types of things. But of course, here's the great part about real food. If you're eating real food, that naturally just happens, right? If you're not sure what real food is, a carrot is real food. A piece of chicken, that's real food. An apple is real food. You get it. It's real food, and we understand that. And if it's in a box and it's processed, it's probably a good chance that it's moved down the chain from real food, and it's not going to be the same, and the nutrients probably not going to be the same, not going to be as bioavailable, and it's not going to have the same effect. So ask yourself, when you look at the cupboard and you've got 100 supplements sitting in there, ask yourself, one, am I deficient in these? And how do I know? And so this is where testing and retesting and optimizing the process is important. So I get my vitamin D tested. I get my omega-3 to 6 ratio tested. These are things I look at in my ongoing testing through whoever's doing the testing for you. I want to check in and make sure what I'm doing is actually appropriate for me. And I can cater that and change that number based on what I'm getting and what I'm seeing in the test results. So instead of guessing at these things, we should be testing these things for ourselves. The other part of it is, again, you just making sure that, because there's a negative effect to this. And this is, I think, what we're getting at is you think, oh, well, no harm, no foul. What's the big deal adding a bunch of nutrients in? If I'm already getting enough, then we'll just top it up and we'll get more and more and more. And as we see in the example with excessive calcium, and possibly with excessive vitamin D as well, because it is a fat-soluble vitamin, and fat-soluble vitamins are and can bioaccumulate in the tissues of your body. Now, with vitamin D, you've got to take quite a bit. It's not really a risk unless you're really overdosing. And most people are deficient anyway. But when it comes to calcium, a lot of people are popping calcium 1,000 milligrams a day, thinking that it's going to strengthen their bones. And they're doing that, many cases without weight-bearing exercise, without some of the other micronutrients that would be important in bone health and bone development. So it's more just going back and asking ourselves, is this something I need? And how do I know? And then am I getting more of something that I need because I don't need it? And is there a risk involved with that? And those are the things I want you to think about. Of course, shoot us any questions. I think that this, of all the podcasts, there's probably a lot of questions here that are individualized to you. Feel free to send us those questions. If you find this on social media somewhere, whether it be Facebook or otherwise, go ahead and post the questions in the feed and we'll do our best to answer those. And thank you so much, guys, for listening and joining the drive to 1 million families worldwide living life by design.